All right, Black Civil War soldiers. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. All persons held as slaves within any states in rebellion against the United States, it declared, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The more than 1 million slaves in the loyal border states and in the Union occupied parts of Louisiana and Virginia were not affected by this proclamation. It also declared that such persons, that is, African American men, of suitable condition, will be received into the armed service of the United States. For the first time, black soldiers could fight for the U.S. Army. Okay, so we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation last week. And that just said that black slaves would be free who were in the Confederate States who were still fighting to be free from the Union. So, and then those men would be allowed to fight in the Union's army, which is the first time that black soldiers could fight for the army. A white man's war. Black soldiers had fought in the Revolutionary War and unofficially in the War of 1812, but state militias had excluded African Americans since 1792. The U.S. Army had never accepted black soldiers. The U.S. Navy, on the other hand, was more progressive. 3 African Americans had been serving as shipboard firemen, stewards, coal heavers, and even boat pilots since 1861. Did you know 16 black soldiers won the Congressional Medal of Honor for their brave service in the Civil War? After the Civil War broke out, abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass argued that the enlistment of black soldiers would help the North win the war and would be a huge step in the fight for equal rights. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters, U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pockets, Douglass said, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. However, this is just what President Lincoln was afraid of. He worried that arming African Americans, particularly former or escaped slaves, would push the loyal border states to secede. This, in turn, would make it almost impossible for the Union to win the war. Okay, so this is saying we want equal rights for black men, for white men, for everybody. Let black men join the war. Let them the eagle on their button. That's the state bird. Let the musket. That's a gun. Let him have bullets. Let him have the power, and then he can have citizenship. Okay. The Second Confiscation and Militia Act of 1862. However, after 2 grueling years of war, President Lincoln began to reconsider his position on black soldiers. The war did not appear to be anywhere near an end, and the Union Army badly needed soldiers. White volunteers were dwindling in number, and African Americans were more eager to fight than ever. When the war first started in 1861, President Lincoln didn't really want African Americans to join. He was afraid that it would shift the power from the Union to the Confederate, and that the Union might lose the war. However, 2 years into the fighting, he started to think maybe I should let African Americans fight. There weren't as many white people volunteering. The Union Army needed people really bad, and African Americans were willing. The Second Confiscation and Militia Act of July 17, 1862, was the first step toward the enlistment of African Americans in the Union Army. It did not explicitly invite blacks to join the fight, but it did authorize the president to employ as many persons of African descent as he may deem necessary and proper for the suppression of this rebellion, in such manner as he may judge best for the public welfare. Okay, so this Second Confiscation Act and Militia Act of July 17, 1962, it didn't say let African Americans join the army, but it did say you can let people of African American descent come help to suppress the rebellion, to stop the Confederate from rebelling or trying to not be with the Union or the United States. So it gave them the power to use their judgment to let as many African Americans help as possible. Some blacks took this as their cue to begin forming infantry units of their own. African Americans from New Orleans formed 3 National Guard units, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Louisiana Native Guard. These became the 73rd, 74th, and 75th United States Colored Infantry, the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, later the 79th United States Colored Infantry, fought in the October 1862 skirmish at Island Mound, Missouri, and the 1st South Carolina Infantry African Descent, later the 33rd United States Colored Infantry, went on its first expedition in 1862. These unofficial regiments were officially mustered into service in January 1863. Okay, so this is just talking about how after the act was passed in right here in July 17th, 1862, some blacks started to make their own kind of infantry units or army units. Um, and this is just telling us about a couple of them. The 54th Massachusetts. Early in February 1863, the abolitionist Governor John A. Andrew of Massachusetts issued the Civil War's first official call for black soldiers. More than 1,000 men responded. They formed the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, the first black regiment to be raised in the North. Many of the 54th soldiers did not even come from Massachusetts. One quarter came from the slave states, and some came from as far away as Canada and the Caribbean. To lead the 54th Massachusetts, Governor Andrew chose a young white officer named Robert Gould Shaw. Okay, so the very first call for black soldiers was in 1863, and 1,000 men came, and they formed the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Okay. On July 18th, 1863, the 54th Massachusetts stormed Fort Wagner, which guarded the port of Charleston in South Carolina. It was the first time in the Civil War that black troops led an infantry attack. Unfortunately, the 600 men of the 54th were outgunned and outnumbered. 17,000 Confederate soldiers waited inside the fort, ready for battle. Almost half of the charging Union soldiers, including Colonel Shaw, were killed. Okay, so the first time that a black infantry went into battle was July 18th, 1863. It was that 54th Massachusetts that we just talked about. They attacked in South Carolina, and it did not go well. There were only 600 Union soldiers and 1,700 Confederate soldiers, and more than half of the Union soldiers died. Confederate threats. In general, the Union Army was reluctant to use African American troops in combat. This was partly due to racism. There were many Union officers who believed that black soldiers were not as skilled or as brave as white soldiers were. By this logic, they thought that African Americans were better suited for jobs as carpenters, cooks, guards, scouts, and teamsters. Black soldiers and their officers were also in grave danger if they were captured in battle. Confederate President Jefferson Davis called the Emancipation Proclamation the most execrable measure in the history of guilty man, and promised that black prisoners of war would be enslaved or executed on the spot. Their white commanders would likewise be punished, even executed, for what the Confederates called inciting servile insurrection. Threats of Union reprisal against Confederate prisoners forced Southern officials to treat black soldiers who had been free before the war somewhat better than they treated black soldiers who were former slaves. But in neither case was the treatment particularly good. Union officials tried to keep their troops out of harm's way as much as possible, but keeping most black soldiers away from the front lines. Okay, so black soldiers were, just because they could join the Union Army didn't mean they were safe. The Confederates said that if they caught the black soldiers, they would be prisoners of wars, they would be enslaved, they could be executed, and they would do the same to the white commanders. Okay, so the Confederates weren't happy about black soldiers joining the Union. A fight for equal pay. Even as they fought to end slavery in the Confederacy, African American Union soldiers were fighting against another injustice as well. The U.S. Army paid black soldiers $10 a week, minus a clothing allowance in some cases, while white soldiers got $3 more, plus a clothing allowance in some cases. Congress passed a bill authorizing equal pay for black and white soldiers in 1864. Okay, so when black soldiers first joined the Army, they got $10 a week, and white soldiers got $13 a week. Not very fair for doing the exact same job. But in 1864, Congress passed a bill saying, nope, you have to make it fair. By the time the war ended in 1865, about 180,000 black men had served as soldiers in the U.S. Army. This was about 10% of the total Union fighting force. Most, about 90,000, were former or contraband slaves from the Confederate States. About half of the rest were from the loyal border states, and the rest were free blacks from the North. 40,000 black soldiers died in the war, 10,000 in battle, and 30,000 from illness or infection. Okay, so when the war ended in 1865, there had been 180,000 black men who served in the army. So that was good. That was 10% of the fighting people. 10,000 of those men, 40,000 of those men died in war, 10 in battle, 30,000 from the illnesses and infections we talked about in the first reading. So that shows you a difference and the beginning for a little bit of equality that was starting to happen.